Long before Nebuchadnezzar became a central figure in the Bible, Babylon was already rising in strength and influence. This great empire began to flourish in the land known as Mesopotamia, near the banks of the Euphrates River. It was a place filled with learning, impressive architecture, and growing political power. At that time, the mighty Assyrian Empire was beginning to fall apart, and Babylon was stepping into the spotlight to take its place. Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, played a key role in this shift. He led a bold revolt against the Assyrians, helping to bring down Nineveh and firmly establish Babylon as an independent force. As a military commander, Nebuchadnezzar served faithfully under his father, and his strength was especially shown during the famous battle against Egypt at Carchemish. That moment changed everything. Babylon was no longer just another regional power. It had become a mighty empire, stretching its rule across lands that had once belonged to Egypt and Assyria. This was the powerful world that Nebuchadnezzar stepped into, not as a poet, a mystic, or a man of quiet contemplation, but as a warrior, a builder, and a king with authority. When Nabopolassar passed away, Nebuchadnezzar wasted no time. He returned quickly to Babylon to secure the throne. This marked the beginning of a reign that would be filled with conquest, great achievements, incredible dreams, and divine encounters that would shape history. As king, Nebuchadnezzar didn't just focus on military victories or expanding his borders. He poured his energy into strengthening Babylon from within. He oversaw the rebuilding of temples, strengthened the city walls, and created monuments of beauty and pride, including the legendary Hanging Gardens, which many say were built for his wife from Media. Babylon flourished under his leadership, but his reign was not just about politics, military campaigns, or cultural achievements. God had a greater purpose at work. The Lord had already spoken through his prophets that Babylon would rise and that Nebuchadnezzar himself would become a tool in God's hands to bring judgment and transformation across nations. It was in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, that the Lord allowed Nebuchadnezzar to set his sights on Jerusalem. The scriptures in Daniel chapter 1 verse 1 declare, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim king of Judah came Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon unto Jerusalem and besieged it." This was no small moment. It was the beginning of a deep and difficult relationship between Babylon and the people of Judah. The Lord allowed this to happen, and part of the temple's sacred treasures were handed over to Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel chapter 1 verse 2 explains, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim king of Judah into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." This wasn't just the loss of precious items. It was a deep wound to the spiritual heart of Judah. Taking holy objects from God's temple and placing them in a pagan house of worship signaled a powerful shift. Babylon was not only taking over territory, it was pressing in on the very identity and faith of the people. Once Nebuchadnezzar had secured captives from Judah, he gave orders to Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs. Ashpenaz was to select the most promising young men from among the captives, those who were physically healthy, intelligent, and eager to learn. Daniel chapter 1 verse 4 records the king's instruction. He wanted children in whom was no blemish, but well-favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning in knowledge and understanding science. These chosen youths were brought to Babylon to be educated in its ways. Among them were 4 remarkable young men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. However, in Babylon their Hebrew names were replaced with new ones, Daniel became Belteshazzar, Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, and Azariah became Abednego. These new names were more than simple labels. They were attempts to reshape their very identity and tie them to the gods and customs of Babylon. The empire wasn't just interested in ruling over them, it wanted to transform who they were. Nebuchadnezzar planned to mold these young men into loyal servants of his kingdom. They were to be taught the language and literature of the Chaldeans. Each day they received a portion of the king's rich food and wine. But Daniel made a quiet, courageous decision. He chose not to eat the king's food so that he would not defile himself. He asked for permission to follow a different path. In Daniel chapter 1 verse 8 it is written, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank." God gave Daniel favor in the eyes of the official who was overseeing them. A test was set up. Daniel and his friends would eat only vegetables and drink water for 10 days. When the days were over, they looked stronger and healthier than those who had eaten from the king's table. Because of this, their diet was continued without objection. Their quiet faithfulness was not forgotten. God honored their decision. When their training came to an end, Nebuchadnezzar tested them himself. He found that Daniel and his companions were wiser and more capable than any of the magicians or astrologers in the entire realm. Daniel chapter 1 verse 20 reveals, "And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm." Though they had been taken from their homeland, stripped of their names and placed in a foreign court, they never turned from the God of Israel. God was now using them to begin his work inside the heart of the very king who ruled the strongest empire on earth. Nebuchadnezzar had witnessed the power of Babylon with his own eyes, its armies, its cities, its wisdom. But now he was beginning to see something greater than earthly strength. Through these young men, he was getting a glimpse of a God who was not limited to one temple or one nation. This God cannot be controlled or housed by human hands. He is the one who holds kings and kingdoms in his hand. The early years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign were laying a foundation for what was to come. The king's path would soon lead him into dreams, warnings, trials, and moments that would shake his understanding of reality. Nebuchadnezzar's story was not just one of conquest, it was the beginning of a journey that would lead him to discover that true power does not come from empire, but from knowing the one who rules over all. Not long after Daniel and his friends had been established in the royal court, King Nebuchadnezzar began to experience troubling dreams. These were not ordinary dreams. Each one disturbed him deeply, shaking his spirit in a way he couldn't ignore. One night, he awoke from his sleep, overwhelmed by a vision that left him restless and uncertain. It troubled him so much that he called for all the magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, and Chaldeans in his kingdom to come before him and offer answers. But the challenge he gave them was unlike anything they had ever faced. He didn't just want them to interpret the dream. He demanded that they tell him what the dream was, without him revealing any of the details. As written in Daniel chapter 2 verse 5, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, "The thing is gone from me. If ye will not make known unto me the dream, with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill." The wise men of Babylon were shocked and desperate. They tried to explain that no human being could do what the king was asking. They said that only the gods could reveal such mysteries, and those gods did not live among men. This response made Nebuchadnezzar furious. He issued a harsh and deadly decree. All the wise men in Babylon were to be executed. Even though Daniel and his companions had not been summoned for the initial interpretation, the order included them as well. When Daniel heard about the decree, he didn't panic. Instead, he responded with wisdom and urgency. He went to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, and asked for time so he could seek an answer, not from men, but from God. Daniel returned home and immediately shared the situation with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to pray with him and ask God to show mercy by revealing the dream and its meaning, so their lives and the lives of the other wise men would be spared. That night, God answered. In a vision, the secret was revealed to Daniel. Moved with deep thankfulness, Daniel praised the Lord. He gave glory to the one who controls kings and kingdoms, saying in Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, "And he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings, and setteth up kings." With this answer in hand, Daniel went to Arioch and asked him to stop the execution of the wise men. He told him that he had the answer the king had been looking for. Daniel was brought before Nebuchadnezzar, and with great humility, he made it clear that the mystery was not revealed by human wisdom. It came from the God in heaven, the one who reveals secrets. He then described the dream in exact detail. Nebuchadnezzar had seen a massive statue in his vision. Its head was made of gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of brass, its legs of iron, and its feet a mix of iron and clay. Then a stone, not cut by human hands, struck the statue at its feet. The whole image shattered into pieces, and the wind carried the fragments away like dust. But the stone that struck the statue grew into a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Daniel explained the meaning of this dream. The head of gold represented Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. As Daniel chapter 2, verse 37 says, "Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory." After Babylon, another kingdom would rise, followed by others, each one weaker than the last. But in the end, God would establish a kingdom that would never be destroyed, a kingdom symbolized by the stone that became a mountain. Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. Daniel had not only described the dream perfectly, but he had also explained what it meant with clarity and confidence. The king was so overwhelmed that he fell on his face before Daniel. He praised him and declared, as written in Daniel chapter 2, verse 47, "Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets." He honored Daniel with a high position, placing him over the entire province of Babylon and making him chief over all the wise men of the kingdom. At Daniel's request, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were also promoted and given responsibilities in the province. But even after seeing what God had revealed through Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar's heart still clung to pride and power. Perhaps inspired by the image from his dream, he ordered the creation of a massive golden statue, this time made entirely of gold, as if to declare that his kingdom would never be replaced. The statue was an enormous structure, 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, set up on the plain of Dura in Babylon. He called together all the high officials from across the empire to witness the dedication of this golden image. A command was then given. When the music played, everyone was to bow down and worship the statue. Daniel chapter 3, verse 6 records the penalty for disobedience. And whoso falleth not down and worshippeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. The music sounded, and the crowd obeyed. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood firm. They refused to bow. Some of the Chaldeans, likely motivated by jealousy, went to the king and reported what had happened. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage. He summoned the 3 young men and gave them one last chance to submit. He warned them again of the fiery punishment, and then challenged them by saying, as found in Daniel chapter 3, verse 15, "And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" But their reply was filled with courage and faith. In Daniel chapter 3, verse 17, they said, "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace." And in verse 18, "But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods." Their answer enraged Nebuchadnezzar even more. He ordered that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than normal. The strongest soldiers in his army were commanded to bind the 3 men and throw them into the fire. The heat was so intense that it killed the soldiers who carried them. But then something unexpected happened. As the king looked into the furnace, his eyes widened in shock. He didn't see 3 men, he saw 4. They were walking freely in the fire, completely unharmed, and the 4th one looked unlike any ordinary man. In Daniel chapter 3, verse 25, Nebuchadnezzar said, "Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God." Nebuchadnezzar called them to come out of the furnace. When they stepped out, everyone saw that not a single hair on their heads was burned. Their clothes weren't damaged. They didn't even smell like smoke. The king was amazed. He declared, as found in Daniel chapter 3, verse 28, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered the servants that trusted in him." He then issued a new decree, commanding that no one in any part of his vast kingdom should speak against their God. He acknowledged that no other God could rescue like this. And he promoted the 3 men to even greater positions of authority in Babylon. Although Nebuchadnezzar had now witnessed miracles and stood in awe of the power of God, his journey wasn't complete. His heart was still being shaped. He spoke words of honor and gave God recognition, but the full understanding of who God truly is had not yet reached the deepest places within him. His story was not finished. God had begun a work in him, through dreams, through divine intervention, and through the bold, unwavering faith of young men who trusted in the unseen hand of heaven. And even the mighty king of Babylon would come to know that the Most High God rules over every kingdom on earth. Nebuchadnezzar was at the height of his power when another disturbing dream came to him, one that felt different from anything he had seen before. It was not just a mysterious vision, it was personal. This dream seemed to reach deep into the core of who he was. Even though he had already seen great displays of divine power and had spoken words of praise, there was still something within his heart that God intended to deal with. In the stillness of the night, the dream came, and it stayed with him. He couldn't shake it. The feeling of unease followed him even after waking, pressing heavily on his thoughts. As he had done before, Nebuchadnezzar summoned all the counselors and advisors in his kingdom, magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, but none of them could give him peace. Their answers were empty, and their wisdom failed him. Once again, he turned to Daniel, the man in whom he believed the spirit of the holy gods lived. This time, he did not hide the dream. He laid it out in full detail before Daniel, speaking with urgency and without reservation. In the dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw a great tree standing in the middle of the earth. It was massive, its height stretching into the heavens. It grew stronger and taller until it was visible from every corner of the world. Its leaves were lush and beautiful, its fruit abundant. It provided food for all living things. Wild animals found shade under it, and birds built their nests in its branches. The entire world seemed to find life and safety through this magnificent tree. But then, something changed. A watcher, a holy messenger from heaven, came down and gave a loud command. The tree was to be cut down. Its branches were to be stripped, its leaves scattered, and its fruit thrown away. The animals and birds were told to flee. Only the stump and roots were to remain, bound with iron and bronze, resting in the grass of the field. The tree would be soaked with the dew of heaven, and the heart of a man would be taken from it, replaced with the heart of a beast. This would last for 7 times to pass over it. The message was not hidden. It was a decree from heaven. Its purpose was made clear, to show that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men, and He alone gives authority to whomever He chooses. As Nebuchadnezzar described the dream, his voice carried the weight of concern. He didn't know what it meant, but he could feel that it was important. When Daniel heard the dream, he fell silent. Scripture says that he was astonished, and his thoughts troubled him. The king noticed Daniel's hesitation and encouraged him to speak freely. Daniel responded with care and respect, expressing that he wished the dream applied to the king's enemies instead. Daniel then gave the meaning. The great tree represented Nebuchadnezzar himself. He was the one who had grown strong and mighty, whose rule stretched far and wide. In Daniel chapter 4, verse 22, it says, "It is thou, O king, that art grown and become strong. For thy greatness is grown and reacheth unto heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth." But the cutting down of the tree was a message of what was to come. The king would be removed from his throne in society. He would live with the beasts in the field, eat grass like oxen, and be drenched with the dew of heaven. This condition would last for 7 times, until he came to understand that it is the Most High who rules over all kingdoms and places people in power according to His will. The stump that was left behind, bound with iron and bronze, meant that the kingdom would be preserved for him, but only after he acknowledged that heaven is in control. With tenderness and concern, Daniel urged the king to change his ways. He didn't just deliver the interpretation, he offered counsel. In Daniel chapter 4, verse 27, he pleaded, "Break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. It may be a lengthening of thy tranquility." It was not a message of doom. It was a message of warning, with an invitation to change. There was still time to turn away from pride and turn toward justice and compassion. But as time passed and daily life in the palace continued, the dream seemed to fade into the background. 12 months later, Nebuchadnezzar stood on the roof of his royal palace in Babylon, looking out at the great city. The buildings, the hanging gardens, the walls, it all stood as a testimony to his strength. He spoke aloud in Daniel, chapter 4, verse 30. Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? But while those words were still on his lips, a voice from heaven broke through. It declared that the kingdom had been taken from him. The time had come. He would be driven away to live with animals. He would eat grass like oxen until he truly understood who rules over kings and kingdoms. The moment the voice spoke, the judgment took hold. His mind left him. His royal robes were taken off, and his place in the palace was gone. He wandered out, no longer aware of who he was. His hair grew long like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. The mighty king who once gave commands across empires was now silent, crawling in fields like a wild beast. No one dared interfere. No one could undo what God had done. Day after day, Nebuchadnezzar remained in that condition. The seasons changed. The palace went on without him. He no longer stood before crowds or sat on a throne. Instead, he lived among the animals, soaked by dew and covered in the dust of the earth. But this was not just judgment. It was a time of transformation. Stripped of his glory and removed from the praise of men, the king was being reshaped in a place where no voices praised him and no servants bowed. God was working in the silence. Then, when the appointed time had passed, something changed. Nebuchadnezzar later shared what happened in his own words. His eyes lifted, not with pride, but with a new kind of recognition. In Daniel chapter 4, verse 34, he said, "And at the end of the days I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me." With that returning understanding came praise. He blessed the Most High. He honored the one whose rule never ends, whose kingdom spans generations, and whose authority cannot be challenged. He no longer spoke of his greatness, but of God's. This restoration wasn't just about his mind. It included his throne, his influence, and his dignity. In Daniel chapter 4, verse 36, he declared, "At the same time my reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom mine honor and brightness returned unto me." His officials sought him out. He was restored to power, and even greater majesty was added to him. But this time, the tone had changed. The man who once claimed to build Babylon by his power now pointed his praise upward. In Daniel chapter 4, verse 37, he said, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment." The vision that once filled him with fear had become a doorway into humility. The journey that began with a dream ended in a transformed heart. Nebuchadnezzar had been brought low, not to be cast aside, but to be brought back in a new way. The tree had been cut down, but its roots were never lost. When the time was fulfilled, the tree stood again, not in pride, but in the knowledge that authority is a gift, not a possession. The king had changed, not through power, but through mercy. And the voice that once called from heaven had now reached the very center of his soul. Nebuchadnezzar was no longer the same man who had once walked proudly through his palace with boastful words on his lips. After going through years of being stripped of his reason and then restored by the hand of God, the final words recorded from him in Scripture carry a quiet, steady strength. He had come to understand something that many rulers never learn: that no kingdom rises without God's permission, and no king remains without God's sustaining hand. His public declaration wasn't made out of fear, but from a deep place of understanding. The man who once viewed himself as the source of all greatness now gave all the glory to the one who holds power, wisdom, and dominion over all. His restoration was more than a return to political authority. It was a turning point in his soul. Nebuchadnezzar closed that chapter of his life with worship, saying in the final verse of Daniel chapter 4, that all God's works are truth, all his ways are justice, and those who walk in pride he can humble. Though Nebuchadnezzar's personal story of transformation ends there in the book of Daniel, the historical impact of his reign continued, woven into the lives of nations and especially in the story of Judah. Even before his humbling, Nebuchadnezzar had been a key figure used by God to bring about judgment. His military campaigns against Jerusalem were not just conquests. They had been spoken of by prophets many years before they ever happened. The fall of Jerusalem was not a random event. It was part of a larger story unfolding across generations. During the reign of King Jehoiakim in Judah, Nebuchadnezzar first came against the holy city. But the next major blow came during the short reign of Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiakim. As recorded in 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 10, at that time the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. Then in verse 11, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city, and his servants did besiege it. Jehoiakim, who was only 18 years old at the time, surrendered after ruling for just 3 months. Along with him, his mother, the royal officials, military leaders, and craftsmen were taken into exile. Nebuchadnezzar also took the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the palace, removing the sacred gold vessels just as God had warned through his prophets. What had once belonged to the house of God was now carried into a foreign land. This exile was more than a political shift. It was spiritual. The people of Judah had continued to turn away from God, and now they were being removed from the land he had given them. As 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 14 explains, and he carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. Only the poorest were left behind. Those taken were not just random citizens, they were leaders, scholars, and skilled workers. Nebuchadnezzar was reshaping Jerusalem's future by removing anyone who could help rebuild it. In place of Jehoiakim, he appointed his uncle Mattaniah as king and changed his name to Zedekiah, a move that symbolized full control over Judah. The renaming of a king showed who held the real power. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign under Babylon's shadow, and he ruled for 11 years. But the relationship was fragile. Despite the covenant he had made with Nebuchadnezzar, Zedekiah rebelled. He placed his hopes in Egypt, believing they could protect him. It was a costly miscalculation. 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 20 reveals the deeper reason behind it all. For through the anger of the Lord it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, until he had cast them out from his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. This act of rebellion triggered Nebuchadnezzar's third and most devastating campaign against Jerusalem. The final siege began in Zedekiah's 9th year of rule. As written in 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 1, "And it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon came, he and all his host, against Jerusalem, and pitched against it, and they built forts against it round about. The city was surrounded. No one could get in or out. For over 2 years, the people were trapped inside as food supplies dwindled. Hunger and fear spread through the city like a plague. When the walls were finally breached, the soldiers of Judah fled by night. But they didn't get far. They were caught in the plains of Jericho, and Zedekiah himself was taken captive. What followed was heartbreaking. Nebuchadnezzar ordered that Zedekiah be brought to Riblah. There he witnessed the execution of his sons, right in front of him. Then, as written in 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 7, they slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and bound him with fetters of brass, and carried him to Babylon. The last image Zedekiah saw was the death of his sons. It was a punishment that went beyond defeat. It was meant to leave a lasting scar. With Zedekiah gone, the last royal leader of Judah's line was removed. The throne of David was empty, and the nation was broken. After that, Nebuchadnezzar's forces went through Jerusalem with devastating force. The city walls were torn down. The temple, once the center of worship and identity, was set on fire. 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 9 says, "And he burnt the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every great man's house burnt he with fire." The destruction was complete. What gold and bronze remained was taken to Babylon. The temple's pillars and sacred vessels, crafted in the days of Solomon, were broken and carried off as spoils. The priests and royal officials were either executed or sent into exile. What had once been the heart of God's chosen nation was now left in ruins. The fall of the temple was more than the loss of a building. It was the end of an era, the place where sacrifices had been offered, where songs of worship had risen, where God's presence had dwelled. It was now ash. The city was empty. The people were scattered. The land that had once flowed with milk and honey now echoed with silence and sorrow. Those who had not been killed were led away to live under Babylonian rule. Those left behind faced hardship and grief. The judgment had come, just as the prophets had warned, and Nebuchadnezzar was the one through whom it was fulfilled. This was not just about power. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't merely expanding his empire. Whether he fully understood it or not, he was part of something greater, God's plan. The conquest of Judah was a divine judgment, and Nebuchadnezzar was the chosen tool. He played a role far beyond his own ambitions. He brought about the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the exile of a nation. Babylon's grip on the land was now unshakable, and the promises of the prophets had come to pass. The kingdom of Judah had fallen, and standing at the center of it all was a king whose hand was guided not just by might, but by the will of heaven. As Jerusalem fell, the fate of King Zedekiah was sealed by the command of Nebuchadnezzar. What happened to him wasn't just a political ending. It was personal and brutal. After fleeing the city, Zedekiah was captured in the plains of Jericho and brought before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah in the land of Hamath. The judgment he faced was severe and deeply cruel. Before anything else, Zedekiah was forced to witness the execution of his sons. It was the last thing he would ever see. As it is recorded in Jeremiah chapter 39, verse 6, "Then the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah in Riblah before his eyes. Also the king of Babylon slew all the nobles of Judah." Immediately afterward, Zedekiah's eyes were put out, and he was bound in chains. Blinded and broken, he was carried away to Babylon. This act wasn't just punishment, it was a complete removal of royal dignity and legacy. Zedekiah's reign ended not in ceremony but in silence and pain. The nobles who had once advised him, the officers who stood beside him in court, all of them were executed. There was no one left to lead, no one to rally the people, no one to carry on the line of David. Jeremiah. Chapter 52, verse 11, confirms the outcome. "Then he put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and the king of Babylon bound him in chains, and carried him to Babylon, and put him in prison till the day of his death." Zedekiah's life did not end quickly. He lived out his final days in captivity, far from his homeland, stripped of power, and without hope of restoration. While Zedekiah's downfall was carried out, the destruction of Jerusalem was unfolding with devastating force. Nebuchadnezzar appointed Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, to finish the work. Under his command, the temple of the Lord was set on fire, along with the royal palace and every significant house in the city. The destruction was complete. Not just major buildings, but every great structure was reduced to rubble. The city walls were torn down so that Jerusalem could never again rise to power or resist Babylon. This was not just a victory, it was a message. Babylon would allow no rival, and Judah's strength was to be completely broken. The sacred objects from the temple, including those that had remained after earlier invasions, were collected and taken to Babylon. Among them were the large bronze pillars, the great sea basin, and various other items used in temple worship. These were broken into pieces and carried away as spoils of war. Both 2 Kings chapter 25 and Jeremiah chapter 52 describe this in detail. Items that had once belonged only to the service of God were now part of Babylon's treasure. Alongside these objects, people were also taken. The priests, the gatekeepers, and other temple workers were rounded up. Some of them were executed at Riblah, others were taken into captivity. The entire spiritual structure of Judah, the rituals, the worship, the leadership, was dismantled alongside the kingdom. Not everyone was taken away. Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to leave behind some of the poorest people in the land. These were individuals with no military value, no political influence, and no means to lead a rebellion. They were given vineyards and fields so the land wouldn't become completely deserted. This was a calculated decision, not an act of kindness. An abandoned land could attract enemies or create chaos, but a quiet, subdued population could still be managed. Judah was no longer a kingdom. It had become a province under Babylon's control, overseen by governors rather than kings, and shaped not by prophets or priests, but by Babylon's commands. In the middle of all this destruction, something unexpected happened. An order from Nebuchadnezzar that spared the life of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah had been accused of discouraging the people by warning them of Babylon's coming conquest. He had been imprisoned and rejected by his nation. Yet the king of Babylon gave specific instructions concerning him. Jeremiah chapter 39 verse 11 says, "Now Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon gave charge concerning Jeremiah to Nebuzaradan the captain of the guard, saying," and in verse 12, Take him and look well to him, and do him no harm, but do unto him even as he shall say unto thee." Nebuzaradan followed the king's command carefully. He found Jeremiah among the captives in Ramah, where he had been placed in chains like the others, but he released him. What followed was remarkable. The Babylonian captain of the guard spoke to Jeremiah with a recognition of the God Jeremiah served. In Jeremiah chapter 40, verse 2, he said, "The Lord thy God hath pronounced this evil upon this place." Then in verse 3, "Now the Lord hath brought it, and done according as he hath said, because ye have sinned against the Lord, and have not obeyed his voice, therefore this thing is come upon you." These were not the words of a man mocking Judah's downfall. They were words of acknowledgement, spoken with weight and clarity. Jeremiah was given a choice. He could go with Nebuzaradan to Babylon and be treated well, or he could stay behind with the remnant in Judah. Jeremiah chose to remain in the land. Nebuzaradan gave him food and a gift and sent him to Gedaliah, the man Nebuchadnezzar had appointed as governor over the remaining people in Judah. In the middle of destruction and loss, Jeremiah was honored. He had endured rejection and suffering, but now he walked free, protected even by the conquerors of his nation. The contrast between Jeremiah and Zedekiah was striking. One man had resisted the word of the Lord and paid with his freedom, his sight, and his legacy. The other had spoken faithfully, endured hardship, and was now walking in dignity. The difference wasn't about title or status, it was about obedience. Jeremiah followed God's command even when it hurt. Zedekiah trusted in human alliances and his judgment. In the end, one was preserved and lifted, the other was brought down and forgotten. And through all of this, Nebuchadnezzar remained at the center. Though he didn't understand every detail of what God was doing, he was being used to carry out God's purpose, shaping the history of nations, fulfilling prophecy, and becoming a part of the story that revealed God's justice, his patience, and his plan for his people. After the destruction of Jerusalem, the land of Judah fell into a heavy silence. The loud cries of war were gone. The crashing of stones from fallen walls, the screams from burning homes, and the clash of weapons had all faded. What remained were broken structures, scattered survivors, and land left hollow, emptied of its kings, warriors, and priests. Nebuchadnezzar had left behind only the poorest of the people, farmers, laborers, and those without status, to tend the fields and prevent the land from turning wild. But even among this remnant, some kind of leadership had to be established. Nebuchadnezzar appointed Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, as governor over Judah. He was stationed in Mizpah, a city north of Jerusalem, to oversee what was left and manage it as a province of Babylon. Gedaliah was a calm and thoughtful man who truly desired peace. He had no ambition for war or rebellion. When the scattered military leaders who had survived the Babylonian invasion heard of his appointment, they came to Mizpah. These men included Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, and Johanan, son of Kareah. Gedaliah welcomed them and encouraged unity. He pleaded with them not to fight, not to resist Babylon, but to work together for peace. In Jeremiah chapter 40, verse 9, Gedaliah said, "Fear not to serve the Chaldeans. Dwell in the land, and serve the king of Babylon, and it shall be well with you." He told them to settle down, harvest wine and oil, and rebuild some kind of normal life in the shadow of Babylon's rule. But the peace Gedaliah tried to build did not last long. His leadership was cut short by betrayal. Johanan, one of the commanders, warned Gedaliah that Ishmael had been secretly sent by the king of Ammon to kill him. He even offered to deal with Ishmael before anything could happen. But Gedaliah refused to believe it. He trusted Ishmael and would not allow anyone to be harmed based on suspicion alone. His decision, though noble, led to tragedy. Ishmael came to Mizpah with 10 men and killed Gedaliah, along with the Jews and Chaldean soldiers who had been stationed there. Panic spread through the land. The people feared that Nebuchadnezzar would see this as rebellion. Those who had begun to rebuild were now terrified. Many started preparing to flee to Egypt, hoping to escape Babylon's anger. While chaos spread in Judah, Nebuchadnezzar continued his campaigns in other regions. His empire stretched far beyond Judah, and his influence was felt across the ancient world. In that broader setting, God was still speaking through his prophets, revealing how Nebuchadnezzar's movements were tied to something bigger than military ambition. The prophet Ezekiel, already living in exile, received a word from God about Nebuchadnezzar's efforts against the city of Tyre. Tyre had resisted Babylon for many years. Nebuchadnezzar's army had laid siege to it with great effort and hardship, but they didn't receive the reward they expected. God acknowledged that campaign. In Ezekiel chapter 29, verse 18, it says, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, caused his army to serve a great service against Tyrus. Every head was made bald, and every shoulder was peeled, yet had he no wages. The soldiers had endured long days and hard conditions, but the wealth of Tyre had slipped away, lost to the sea or absorbed by others. Then came God's promise of compensation. Not from Tyre, but from Egypt. In Ezekiel chapter 29, verse 19, the Lord declared, Behold, I will give the land of Egypt unto Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he shall take her multitude, and take her spoil, and take her prey, and it shall be the wages for his army. This was more than a military reward. It was a decision made in heaven. Nebuchadnezzar's conquests were being directed by God's hand, even when the king himself had no idea. Again and again, the prophets revealed that Nebuchadnezzar was not just a powerful ruler. He was being used for a specific purpose. In Jeremiah chapter 25, God explained through the prophet that he was sending Nebuchadnezzar as part of his judgment. In verse 9, the Lord said, Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon my servant, and will bring them against this land. That phrase, my servant, stood out. God called this Gentile king his servant, not because Nebuchadnezzar followed him, but because he was being used to fulfill God's plans. Jeremiah also warned that the judgment wouldn't stop with Judah. Nebuchadnezzar would go on to bring down other nations as well. These were kingdoms that had trusted in idols, alliances, or false strength. In Jeremiah chapter 27, the Lord told the prophet to send messages to Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon. They were to submit to Babylon or be destroyed. In verse 6, God declared, And now have I given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon my servant. He even said that the wild animals would obey him. It was a clear and unshakable message. Resist Babylon, and you will fall. Submit, and you will live. This message didn't sit well with everyone. Many in Judah, including false prophets, refused to believe that God would use a foreign king. They claimed that freedom was near and that the power of Babylon would soon break. But Jeremiah stood firm. He delivered God's truth, even when people hated him for it. He reminded them that Nebuchadnezzar wasn't operating apart from God's control. His rise to power had been allowed, and his reach would continue until God brought it to an end. The fact that God called Nebuchadnezzar my servant did not mean the king was holy or that Babylon's violence was good. It meant God was still in control. Even the mightiest rulers of earth could be instruments in his hands. Every city Nebuchadnezzar entered, every victory he claimed, every treasure he seized, all of it was woven into a larger plan. God was using these moments to bring justice, correction, and eventually restoration. Nebuchadnezzar was a tool shaped for a difficult season in history when God's voice was speaking not only through prophets but through the rise and fall of nations. As the remnant in Judah wrestled with fear and confusion, wondering whether to stay or flee to Egypt, God's message stayed the same. Don't trust in fear. Don't lean on human strategies. Trust the one who holds all nations in his hand. Whether through Jeremiah's quiet warnings or Ezekiel's visions from exile, God was making something very clear. Nebuchadnezzar's victories were not accidents. They were not the work of one man's ambition alone. They had been foretold, written in prophecy, and carried out with precision. In this chapter of Nebuchadnezzar's story, we see a man moving from city to city, reshaping the world as he goes. But what looks like the path of a powerful king is also the path of a man unknowingly walking within the boundaries set by heaven. His footsteps changed history, but every step was watched by the one who had already spoken through his servants. Nebuchadnezzar didn't see the whole picture. He didn't need to, because long before he lifted his sword or issued a command, God had already spoken, and the world was moving in the direction he had declared. In the Bible, Nebuchadnezzar is not remembered as a man who did everything right. He is remembered as a man who changed. His greatness didn't protect him from God's correction. It placed him in a position to be humbled so that he could learn what many never do, that kingdoms rise and fall by God's will. His story became a witness, not a tale of flawless leadership, but a living testimony that God is the one who rules over the kingdoms of men and gives them to whom he will. It wasn't a truth Nebuchadnezzar read in a scroll or heard from a priest. It was something he had to live, endure, and declare for himself. Nebuchadnezzar's story closes not with collapse, but with clarity. He began with pride, built an empire with power, and finished with praise. His life shows that God's authority doesn't stop at the temple gates or the borders of Israel. It reaches into palaces, speaks into dreams, and reshapes the hearts of kings. And when that voice is heard, when it finally breaks through, even those who once thought themselves untouchable can lift their eyes to heaven and speak the truth that was always there, that God alone reigns forever. This is the end. If you found this video valuable, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up. It helps share God's word with more people. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications so you never miss out on powerful biblical teachings. Thanks for watching, and until next time, God bless you.